I'll tell you what else. This whole situation in the Ukraine, that wouldn't be happening on my watch. Problem is now we all have a president who's afraid. And that's why Joe and the Ho have got to go. And I'll tell you another thing.
The question of if and how South Park would address Gaza has been hanging over the fanbase for a while now. I mean, we're talking about a show that has never shied away from controversial topics, a show that built its reputation on going exactly where other comedies wouldn't dare to tread. But Gaza is different. It's not just controversial, it's a geopolitical minefield where every single word gets scrutinized, where any attempt at commentary gets immediately weaponized by one side or the other, and where the human cost is so staggering that making jokes about it feels almost impossible. So when episode after episode of this season passed without any mention of it, some fans started wondering if maybe, just maybe, this was the one topic South Park was going to avoid. And honestly, that would have been understandable. The discourse around Israel and Palestine has become so toxic, so polarized, that even attempting to have a nuanced conversation feels like walking through a minefield blindfolded. But then, conflict of interest dropped, and within the first few minutes, we get this betting app storyline, where one of the possible bets is whether Kyle's mom will strike Gaza and destroy a Palestinian hospital. And immediately, you know exactly what South Park is doing here. They're not approaching this topic head-on from the start. They're using their classic technique of building a framework that allows them to explore the issue from multiple angles, while keeping the story grounded in the kid's perspective. And that framework is absolutely brilliant because it does something really important. It shows how desensitized we've become to the violence in Gaza. These kids are treating the potential bombing of a hospital like it's a football game, like it's just another thing to bet on, another way to make some quick cash. This is textbook South Park structure. Take a real-world issue, filter it through the perspective of the kids, and use their reactions to highlight how absurd the adult world has become. But what makes this particular approach so effective is that it acknowledges something really uncomfortable: the normalization of violence in Gaza, the way we've all, to some degree, become numb to the headlines about airstrikes and civilian casualties and destroyed hospitals. By framing it as a betting market, South Park is forcing us to confront that desensitization. And Cartman, being Cartman, immediately sees an opportunity to exploit the situation for profit. He's not thinking about the human cost. He's not considering the implications. He's just calculating odds and figuring out how to manipulate his classmates into making bets that will benefit him financially. Which again is classic Cartman, but it also serves as a pretty apt metaphor for how a lot of people and institutions have treated this conflict, reducing human suffering to political talking points, fundraising opportunities, or in this case, literal gambling odds. Now, the genius of this setup is that it creates genuine suspense throughout the episode because of Sheila's history. And this is where knowing South Park lore becomes absolutely crucial to understanding why this episode works so well. Sheila Broflovsky has a pretty established track record when it comes to, well, let's call it overreacting to things she finds offensive. The entire South Park movie, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, is basically driven by Sheila's outrage spiral. She gets mad about a movie, starts a censorship campaign, becomes Secretary of War, and literally starts World War III with Canada. That's not an exaggeration, that's the actual plot of the movie. We know she's capable of taking things way too far. We know that when she gets into one of her self-righteous fury modes, the consequences can be catastrophic, and the episode really leans into this tension. Cartman is freaking out because he bet against Sheila bombing anything, and now she's actually going to Israel, and he's terrified that she's going to cost him all the money he stole from his mom's bank account. The other kids are watching the odds shift in real time. Kyle is desperately trying to defend his mom while also being completely mortified that this is even a conversation people are having. And all of this builds to what could have been a really predictable punchline. Sheila goes to Israel, gets caught up in the conflict, and either does or doesn't do something violent, confirming or subverting our expectations in a way that makes a joke out of the entire situation. But that's not what happens. And that's why this episode is so much more than just South Park doing their usual shtick. Instead of using Sheila's trip to Israel as a setup for a visual gag or a cheap shock, they use it as an opportunity to deliver some of the most direct and unflinching commentary the show has ever made about Israel's actions in Gaza. and they do it through Sheila's voice, which is absolutely perfect, because Sheila's rage has always been her defining characteristic. But for once, that rage is directed at someone who actually deserves it. Not at a cartoon, not at a misunderstanding, but at a world leader who is actively causing immense suffering and then hiding behind accusations of anti-Semitism whenever anyone criticizes him. The scene where Sheila confronts Netanyahu is legitimately powerful in a way that South Park rarely attempts. She's not there to bomb anyone. She's there to tell him exactly what he's doing, exactly how he's weaponizing Jewish identity to shield himself from accountability. The way South Park frames Sheila's confrontation with Netanyahu is incredibly deliberate and honestly kind of brilliant, because it cuts through all the noise that usually surrounds this conversation. When Sheila gets face-to-face with him, she doesn't mince words. She calls him out for killing thousands of people, for flattening entire neighborhoods, and then for wrapping himself in Judaism like it's some kind of shield from criticism. And that phrasing, wrapping yourself in Judaism like it's a shield, that's the entire point South Park is making here. Because that's exactly what has been happening. Any criticism of Israel's military actions gets immediately reframed as anti-Semitism. Any attempt to discuss the humanitarian crisis in Gaza gets shut down with accusations of hatred toward Jewish people. And the result is that actual Jewish people, especially American Jews who have nothing to do with these decisions, end up bearing the brunt of the backlash. Sheila explicitly states this. She tells Netanyahu that he's making life for Jews miserable and making life for American Jews impossible, and this is where South Park's approach becomes genuinely important rather than just clever. They're using a Jewish character, Kyle's Jewish mom, to make this distinction crystal clear. This isn't Jews versus Palestinians. This is Israel versus Palestinians. And the conflation of those two things, the deliberate blurring of that line by Netanyahu and his supporters, that's what's causing so much of the problem. Because when you can't criticize a government's actions without being accused of bigotry, when you can't express concern for civilian casualties without being labeled as anti-Semitic, then you've created a situation where atrocities can continue unchecked, because the people committing them have weaponized identity as a defense mechanism. And South Park isn't being subtle about this. The entire episode is about conflicts of interest, right? That's the title, that's the theme that runs through every single subplot. And what Netanyahu is doing, using Jewish identity to protect Israeli government actions, that's the ultimate conflict of interest. He's conflating his political decisions with the identity of an entire people, creating a situation where criticizing him means criticizing all Jews, at least in the narrative he's constructed. And that's not just dishonest, it's actively harmful to the people he claims to be protecting. The episode makes this connection explicit through Kyle's journey. At the start, Kyle is outraged that people are betting on his mom, that they're treating this serious issue so flippantly. He keeps trying to explain that Jews and Palestinians aren't football teams you bet on, that this isn't a game, that real people are suffering and dying. But nobody listens to him. They just see the odds, they see the potential profit, they see the entertainment value. And Kyle's frustration throughout the episode mirrors the frustration that a lot of Jewish people feel when they try to criticize Israel's actions. They get accused of being self-hating Jews, they get told they're betraying their own people, they get shut down and dismissed because they're not falling in line with the narrative that Israel equals Judaism, and any criticism of Israel is therefore anti-Semitic. By having Kyle be the voice of moral clarity throughout the episode, by having him be the one who sees how wrong all of this is, South Park is making it clear that being Jewish and opposing Israel's actions in Gaza aren't contradictory positions. They're completely compatible, and in fact, a lot of Jewish people hold both of those identities simultaneously. But the way the discourse has been framed makes it almost impossible to express that without facing backlash from multiple directions. They're picking sides, they're keeping score, they're more invested in being right than in the actual human cost of what's happening. And by turning that into an actual betting market in the show, South Park makes the callousness of that approach impossible to ignore. Now, the other thing that makes Sheila's confrontation with Netanyahu so effective is that it doesn't come out of nowhere. The episode earns that moment by building the tension throughout, by making us wonder what Sheila is going to do, by playing with our expectations based on her history. And when she finally gets there and starts laying into Netanyahu, it's cathartic not just because of what she's saying, but because the episode has been building to this release of tension for the entire runtime. Cartman is convinced she's going to bomb something. The other kids are watching nervously. Kyle is defending her while also being terrified of what she might do. And then when the moment comes, she does something way more powerful than violence. She speaks truth to power. She calls out a world leader for his actions and for the way he manipulates identity to avoid accountability. And the fact that this comes from Sheila, a character who has historically been the butt of jokes about overreacting and causing international incidents, that makes it even more impactful. South Park is Essen, which, again, is perfect Cartman characterization. But it also serves as a pretty clear parallel to how a lot of people and institutions have approached this conflict. There's money to be made, there's political capital to be gained, there's opportunities to exploit, and the actual human beings caught in the middle of all this become secondary considerations at best. The betting app framework really drives this home because it literalizes something that's usually more abstract.